Somewhere around the 20th year of King David's reign of Israel, his son Absalom marched on Jerusalem, leading a conspiracy to usurp the throne. However, the story of Absalom's rebellion starts 11 years earlier. Hello, I'm Knight Jake, and welcome to Bible Wars. Now, the story of Absalom's rebellion begins in the 13th chapter of the second book of Samuel. Absalom was the son of King David and Maachah, the daughter of Tamar, the king of the city of Geshur. Absalom had a sister named Tamar, who was regarded as very beautiful. So beautiful, in fact, that their half-brother Amnon, born of King David and Ahinoam of Jezreel, fell in love with Tamar. Amnon was so fixated on his half-sister that he made himself ill with stress over her. There was nothing he could do, for Tamar was his half-sister and he could not possibly marry her. Sexual relations between siblings, including half-siblings, were condemned by the scriptures. And so Amnon was miserable because he could not marry the one he loved, because she was his half-sister. Now Amnon had a close friend who was named Jonadab. Now Jonadab was actually Amnon's first cousin, as Jonadab was the son of King David's brother Shimea. Jonadab is described in 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 3 as a very crafty man. Jonadab came to Amnon and asked him why he looked so miserable. Amnon told him his predicament, that he was in love with his half-sister. Now Jonadab devised a plan for Amnon, telling him to lie in your bed, pretend to be ill, and when your father comes to see you, ask that he will send Tamar to bring you food and prepare it in your sight, and to feed you with her own hand. And then, that is when you have your chance to lie with her. Take her as your own. And this is exactly what Amnon did. He pretended to be sick. And when King David came to visit, Amnon asked that Tamar would come and take care of him. So David sent Tamar to look after her half-brother. Tamar came and she made Amnon cakes to eat and set them before him. But he refused to eat them, requesting that everybody else be sent out. Most likely, Amnon claimed that it was embarrassing for a grown man to be hand-fed by a woman, and thus everyone else should be sent out, lest they see him and he be shamed. So everyone left, and Amnon called for Tamar to bring the cakes to his bedside. As she did, Amnon grabbed her and urged her to lie with him. She refused, crying, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I go to carry my shame? And as for you, you would be regarded as one of those outrageous fools in all of Israel." She urged him to let her go, claiming that he should ask David for her hand in marriage. For surely David would not refuse such a marriage. But Amnon would not listen to her, most likely knowing that David would never bless such an incestuous marriage. And since Amnon was stronger than her, he took hold of her and raped her. After this, Amnon, feeling the guilt and shame of his actions, hated Tamar with a passion. His hate for her was greater than he had ever loved her, and so he ordered her to leave. But Tamar refused, saying, "The wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me." But again Amnon would not listen to her, and instead he called one of the male servants to take her away and lock the door behind her. And so Tamar went home and tore her robe, the one especially worn by the virgin daughters of King David. She put ash on her head. She buried her head into her hands, and she wept aloud as she mourned her virginity. Absalom, heard her and came to her aid. Absalom asked his sister, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" Absalom automatically determined what was wrong. Tamar had been at Amnon's place, and now she had torn her virginal dress and was in a state of mourning. "Be at peace, my sister," said Absalom to Tamar, attempting to comfort her. He then added the words, "He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." Now how could Absalom say such a thing? Don't take it to heart. This poor woman had just been raped. Was Absalom trying to hush up this scandal lest the shame spread throughout the kingdom? Surely not, for soon everyone would hear of it, especially since Tamar was now living with Absalom as a desolate woman. That is, a woman that no one would ever desire to be their wife. Perhaps Absalom was planning something already. Or perhaps he was just being a good son and citizen and was waiting for King David as the king and father to deal with this matter. When the news came to King David, he was furious, and yet he did nothing. Why? Was it because he desired to keep the scandal quiet? Or was it because there was nothing he could do? Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 28 to 29 says that if a man rapes an unbetrothed virgin, he shall give her father the bridal price of 50 shekels of silver, and he shall take her as his wife, and he may never divorce her. Exodus chapter 22 verses 16 and 17 expand this further, stating that if a man has sexual relations with an unbetrothed virgin, the text does not say whether it's consensual or rape, he is to pay the father the bride price and take her as his wife. However, if the father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay the money equal to the bridal price. The father of the girl has the right to refuse the marriage between a rapist and his victim. It is possible that David refused the marriage because Scripture condemns intercourse between siblings. Of course, David couldn't expect that Amnon and Tamar be married. If he had forced them to be married, this would mean that they would have to be a married couple that never slept together. But this also wouldn't work because Scripture clearly intends for a husband and wife to be united in sexual intercourse. Therefore, David could have simply decided that it was best for Amnon and Tamar to remain unmarried. However, Amnon should have still paid the bridal price to David. Yet, the scriptures never mention any payment being made. In addition to all of this, Deuteronomy chapter 27 verse 22 says that if a man lies with his sister, whether she be his half-sister or full blood, he is accursed. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 17 states that if a man takes his sister and uncovers her nakedness, in other words, sleeps with her, they are to be cut off and they are to bear their iniquity. Now, Leviticus says the word they, but this is because the context of Leviticus chapter 20 verse 17 is in regards of consensual incestuous relations. But obviously, in the case of rape, the rapist alone should bear this iniquity. Thus, he would be cut off. Now, this phrase, cut off, could possibly refer to an execution, but most likely it refers to being exiled from the community. Therefore, even though David couldn't have Amnon marry Tamar, he should have at least exiled Amnon out of the country. Instead, David did nothing. The Dead Sea Scrolls stated that David would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him, since he was his firstborn. As Amnon was the firstborn of David, David thought it best not to send him away. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that David failed, both as a father for failing to punish his son, and also as the king for failing to punish a criminal. But as for Absalom, his anger for Amnon grew worse and worse, and he refused to talk to his brother ever again. The matter was not settled between these two, and Absalom plotted his revenge. And after 2 full years of waiting, Absalom had his chance. Absalom had some sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. Now, sheep shearing was a time of feasting and a time of celebration. And Absalom invited all the king's sons to come along and celebrate. He came before King David and requested that the king and all his servants come for the celebration. But David responded, "No, my son, let us not all go, lest we become burdensome to you." Absalom pushed him, but David said no. Then Absalom said, "If you won't come, then at least send Amnon with us." Confused by the request, David asked why. He thought that Absalom hated Amnon. Why would he want to invite him to his festival? But Absalom pushed the matter until David finally agreed and sent Amnon and the rest of his sons with Absalom. There was about 19 sons in total. While they celebrated, Absalom commanded his servants, "When Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and I yell out, 'Strike Amnon!' then you kill him. Don't be afraid, for I have commanded you. Be courageous and valiant." So the servants did just as Absalom commanded. When the brothers were drinking wine, and Amnon became merry and tipsy, Absalom cried out, "Strike Amnon!" And his servants struck down Amnon. And the rest of the brothers mounted their mules and fled. While the brothers fled, news came to King David that Absalom had struck down all the king's sons, leaving none of them alive. And David tore his garments and lay on the ground mourning. His servants around him also tore their garments. But Jonadab came forward to comfort David. He said, "Surely Absalom hasn't killed all your sons, but only Amnon. For Absalom has hated Amnon ever since he violated Tamar. Therefore, my lord the king, do not think that all your sons are dead, but Amnon alone is dead." And soon after, the young man who kept watch spotted a group of people approaching the city. And Jonadab said to the king, "Behold, the king's sons have returned just as I said." And as soon as he had finished speaking, the king's sons arrived weeping, and David also wept with them. But as for Absalom, he fled and went to his grandfather, Tamar, king of Geshur. And there he stayed as King David mourned for Absalom. David longed to see his son. He wished he could go to him. David had ceased his grieving for Amnon and was instead comforted by the fact that Amnon was dead. For Absalom had achieved his revenge, and David would no longer be fearing Amnon's safety. Now David turned his grief to Absalom, for while Absalom was in exile, he was as good as dead to David. This ends part 1 of Absalom's rebellion. Join us next time when we continue our history with Absalom's return to Jerusalem. I've been your host, Knight Jake. Goodbye, and God bless. If you do like the work of the Order of Knight George, you can support us by going over to our Patreon page. I will include a link to our Patreon page in the description below.